Good morning. Sunday morning, beautiful morning out here. I'm excited to spend a bit of time with you. I want to talk about something that's really, really dear to my heart, and I think critically important to anyone who um, values the New Testament and is interested in studying it or in really like getting beyond uh, the gist of it and trying to piece it together, especially when it comes to the gospel. So my topic today is the forgotten gospel, and it's based on an article I wrote about 3 or 4 weeks ago, maybe a little bit more. It's on Substack, and I decided to go this route because I wanted to spend a bit more time in New Testament studies, especially the Gospels, because my aim is really to get to getting to know more about the historical Jesus. And so on my way there, one of the most important discoveries I made, let me just clarify, it's not that I discovered this and nobody else knows about it. We're not talking about revelation. I discovered that scholars knew about this for decades before anybody told me. So I had to go find out myself. But the issue is with regards to the Gospel of Mark, um, the small, little, often obscure and forgotten gospel within the Big Four. Um, and so I want to spend a bit of time on that today and just highlight some things which I do really believe they're important, at least, but at most critical for understanding the New Testament or the actual life of Jesus. So I started the article by just painting a little picture. When I was a teenager in the 80s, late 80s, it was all neon and we had Walkmans, and I wasn't allowed to listen to any music besides Amy Grant. Was like the wildest thing. How could Baby Baby, right? And that wasn't even a Christian song. So that was already really on the border. Uh, it would have suited me better if Sandy Patty and Carmen were the things I'd listened to. My dad preferred those. But anyway, I remember very well back at that time at our youth services, we put a lot of emphasis on people coming to Jesus because we were worried they were going to go to hell. And so we had people come in, and one of the first things they were told is that if you want to read the Gospels, if you want to read the Bible or the New Testament, you need to make sure that you get yourself stuck into the Gospel of John. Because it was felt that the Gospel of John is the best expression of who Jesus actually is. So I've got my article here, and I'm just going to refer to it from time to time to make sure I stay on track and don't take too much time. So the point was, I mean, if you really think about it, if you know the Gospels, you'll know that the Gospel of John has all the juicy bits. But the Gospel of John is the gospel where water gets turned into wine. It's the gospel of the resurrection, or maybe more accurately, the resuscitation of Lazarus. It's the gospel in which one of my favorite stories are found, the adulterous woman that's brought before the Pharisees. She was caught in action, and Jesus says, cast the first stone. It's the gospel where, the only one, by the way, where we read about being born again. It's the gospel that majors on the coming of the Holy Spirit and its job, its function. And it's the gospel in which Jesus publicly makes the statements we Christians love the most. And those are the statements in which he declares himself one with the Father. And then John is portrayed as someone that comes from the heavens, comes into the earth to tell us about the Father, show the Father. Then he goes back and he prepares a place, and we all end up in the same place. Right. So I think the reason why we wanted people to read the book of John is we didn't want them to read the other gospels first, because they just don't contain these juicy bits. And in fact, all the things I've just mentioned, we don't find in a gospel like Mark or Matthew or Luke. They are mostly, or some of these things are exclusively found in John, which makes John very unique. But I think it's quite clear that the Jesus we followed, and the Jesus that many Christians follow today, is really the Jesus of the Gospel of John, the Christ of Christianity, if we could say it that way, is most clearly identified with the Jesus we see in the Gospel of John. Right. Um, so it is quite clear to me that the Gospel of John is kind of like the antecedent for the kind of Christ of Christianity we have today. Now, once you finish the Gospel of John, then you can go to something like Matthew. Now, Matthew was second on the list. It's first in chronological order of the way the Bible is put together. And Matthew is an amazing gospel about the life of Jesus. It's elaborate when compared, for instance, to something like Mark. It's got a lot more juicy bits around the edges, a lot more teaching than what Mark might have. And then, of course, Luke as well. Now, what these two gospels have that John, for instance, doesn't have is firstly the virgin birth, right? They have the Lord's Prayer, the Beatitudes, the Last Supper. Some people are surprised when they hear that John, in fact, does not have the Last Supper in it. In Matthew and Luke also, there are many exorcisms, which was a big part of Jesus' ministry. Of course, we have the legendary parables about the kingdom of God. The kingdom is like, used in simile form. The kingdom is like, and there's a parable of a mustard seed and the net and the feast, etc., etc. So we would want new converts to then move into Matthew and Luke. And the reason why we didn't stick with John is all the things I've just mentioned are not in John. There are no parables about the kingdom of God. There are no exorcisms. There's no beatitudes. There's no virgin birth, etc., etc. The list is long, and I think this subconsciously made it true already that we knew that these gospels were extremely different. So we kind of had to tell people in what priority they needed to read it, especially Matthew and Luke. If you're a fan of Christmas, of course, John won't give you Christmas or Armageddon, but Matthew and Luke will do a good job at that. And then there was the Gospel of Mark, the black sheep, the black sheep of the family. Short, just after Matthew, squeezed between Matthew and Luke, kind of obscure, and not really something we'd point anyone to. And it was, I think the main reason is that Mark doesn't have anything unique. Everything you see in Mark, you can basically find in Matthew, and most of it you can find in Luke. We grew up in the tradition that Mark was basically a summary of Matthew. Okay, so why would I read the summary if I can get the whole story in Matthew? That was kind of my way of thinking about it. The differences between Mark and Matthew for me at that time, it wasn't that obvious. It made sense to me that Mark, as a summary, will leave off some things, and that I could just go there for a double reference. But most of the time, if I wanted something about the life of Jesus, I would probably just go to Matthew. We also believe that this was a summary and that it was written by a man by the name of John Mark, who was kind of like a secretary for Peter, and wrote down, if you go to the tradition, the church tradition and where it comes from, one that wrote down from Peter's teachings what he could remember as best as he could. He wrote down this gospel. Why would anyone anyway read Mark? Because Mark is quite unique as well in some sense. No birth narrative, once again, no Sermon on the Mount. In Mark, Jesus is secretive about his identity. He never goes out telling people who he is. When they find out, mostly, he asks them to keep silent. In Mark, a very prominent theme is also the disciples never really understand. For instance, to give you a good example, when Jesus walks on water in Matthew, the disciples say, "Hello, this is the Son of God," right? When he walks on water in Mark, they don't understand and their hearts are hardened. They don't say anything. They don't say he's the Son of God. It's literally the opposite. They don't know what's going on. Where in Matthew, they kind of understand. Another really striking thing about Mark, and this you'll come across very quickly if you do a little bit of study, is that scholars are virtually united in understanding that the last portion of Mark was added much later, at least a century later. Now, this is the portion that comes after the ladies, Mary and her entourage, finds the tomb empty, right? So it's not that Mark's not saying there is no resurrection, but Mark does not have resurrection or ascension stories. the ones we do find in Mark, I think it's, I can't remember the chapter number, but after the ladies find the tomb empty, seems to be summaries that were later added on. Some say they come from the other Gospels. Later scribes took them and placed them in there. But there's something that makes Mark quite unique. No birth narrative, no resurrection stories, appearances stories as such, and really no idea on any ascension either. So this dulls down Mark in some way. Like, I mean, if you're giving your friend a new Christian something to read, which proves the resurrection, which is the absolute cornerstone of Christianity, Mark is the don't read Mark, go somewhere else, right? So these are the things that are quite unique about Mark. And for all of my time in ministry as a pastor, Mark was literally the last gospel I'd ever really turned to. Didn't know it very well, didn't really care too much for it because I had Matthew and I had John. And from Matthew and John, Luke on occasion, I could kind of figure things out. Mark was like on the reading priority list is just above Leviticus, basically. And if you've ever attempted to read Leviticus, you'll understand what I mean. It was only about 30 years into my journey as a Christian that I kind of started realizing something is wrong about the way I read the Bible. I started investigating properly, and I realized then the Gospels were more unique than what I thought. I would start reading them in parallel, in other words, next to each other, to see how the stories differ, how the chronology differ. I'm an Excel person, so I make Excel sheets or number sheets in Apple of the words, the events, and I would make notes of how each one of these differ. And I came to the conclusion that they are way more different than what I thought they were, especially when it comes to John, of course. But even differences between Matthew, Luke, and Mark are remarkable. Some are very trivial and simple, but others are remarkable and on very, very important subjects. Well, anyway, for the first time, I realized that my idea of the Gospels, or my methodology with the Gospels, unknowingly was a synthesis. I harmonized the Gospels, and in my head, the idea I had of Jesus was a forced harmony of all the Gospels put together. And it's beyond the scope of today, but I later on realized that I would have to create a gospel that doesn't exist. This harmonized version is not written down anywhere. I'm basically inventing something because I had a priori kind of a presupposition that they all had to be exactly 100% true. So the only way that can be a new kind of a gospel in my own head. But here's the thing that I found incredibly important. As I later on discovered, and that's what this session is about, is that Mark might actually be the most important of all the Gospels. If you are interested in the historical Jesus, right? Not so much the theological construction or the Christ of Christianity, as we say today, but if you're interested, and that's what I became interested in, what did Jesus really say? Did he say, blessed are the poor, or did he say, blessed are the poor in spirit? Because they mean very different things. They apply very differently to situations. And I became interested in wanting to know which one is closer to what the historical Jesus would actually have said. The example I mentioned just a moment ago, which one was more closer to what the disciples, what their response really would have been like when they believed they saw Jesus walking on water? Was it more likely for them to call out Son of God, or was it more likely that they didn't understand and that they were confused in that moment? Because those things seems to be, to me at least, to be quite opposite in nature. So I started looking at the Gospels anew, and this is where all the avenues I took, all the scholars I read, were all pointing to Mark and saying, look at Mark, and using Mark. And I wanted to know why this was. I started looking at Mark as more than just a summary of Matthew, because I realized that it wasn't, and I realized that most scholars did not consider it to be that in the first place. And that brought a lot of questions to the front. Why is Mark so different to these others? And so on. So here's some what today are considered, a lot of people, we don't distinguish between the idea of fact and theory, and I I want to go into this. But for all intents and purposes, let me realize I normally use just scholarly consensus is in fact that Mark was written first. Right. So if Mark was written first, Mark cannot be a summary of Matthew. That's an important point to make. It also, we have to consider, and the dates for these are more or less Mark in the 70s or around the 70 AD, which is 40 years after Jesus. And then Matthew and Luke around the 85 mark, depending on who you ask, but between 80 and 90. So give yourself another 10 to 20 years, 1 to 2 decades after Mark. Now, when it comes to the writing of kind of a biography, I guess for lack of a better word, you tend to want to read the earliest one, especially if it's already 40 years removed from the person's life. And you want to read the others a while later, but there's something in us, and I think there's a validity here, and is that the earliest one is most probably going to be the one that is closest to the actual events. It is in chronology, it is, or chronologically, it is, but also in content, it might actually be closer. Now, it's not always true that the earliest writing is more accurate than the later writing, and there are examples that, for instance, the trial of Jesus, a lot of scholars might say that even the Gospel of John has a more accurate portrayal of what a trial would have been like than what Mark, Matthew, or Luke has. But there should be an alarm bell going off here that we cannot just necessarily prioritize Matthew and say that Matthew is obviously the more accurate one because it has more information. And this kind of set me off on a little adventure, I guess. But as I said, firstly, this would mean that Mark cannot be a summary of Matthew, or Luke for that matter. Right. So the second piece of information that kind of came as a shock to me, and then later on as I continued to read, I realized once again, it's only me that doesn't know this. Scholars have been working on this for decades, if not at least a century and a half, is this, and they're quite unanimous on this as well, that Matthew and Luke had Mark in front of them when they were writing their Gospels. Now, this changes everything. Not only is Mark earlier, someone writing just a decade earlier, but Matthew and Luke, in fact, had Mark, and they added to Mark and revised Mark. They edited Mark 10 to 20 years later. The reason why they know this is the verbatim agreements between Matthew and Luke, and there's really no other way that someone can have verbatim agreements of sentences and large portions unless someone's copying somebody else. And the consensus is that Mark was not copying or summarizing Matthew, but in fact that Matthew was, and Luke was using Mark to write their Gospels, right? So just after these two things, Mark is earlier, at least a decade or two, and Matthew and Luke actually used Mark. That should now tell you why Mark is so important. Because if Mark was not important to that time or considered grossly inaccurate by the people or the Christians of that time, then Matthew and Luke would not have used Mark to the degree that they did, right? So, more or less, to give you an idea, 90% of Mark we find in Matthew. That's remarkable, remarkable. And some of this, quite a lot of this is verbatim. So that's remarkable. And about 65% of Mark is found in Luke. So Matthew is much closer to Mark, and Luke is a little bit further in terms of structure and content. Let's leave it at that. But it is remarkable that Matthew would absorb 90% of Mark. So I'm just going to focus on Matthew, Mark, Matthew, and possibly John today. it is remarkable that Matthew would absorb so much of the Markian work, which tells us that he trusted the Markian author. He might not have known him. We don't know. We don't know who the authors were. We'll get to that in a moment. But he did use it a lot. He used it verbatim a lot. But we also know that he added to that. For instance, a virgin birth was added to Mark. Genealogies were added. A lot of teaching was added, which Mark didn't have. Like, for instance, the Sermon on the Mount. The resurrection appearances. Matthew gets from another source we might not know, we don't know where, but he doesn't get it from Mark. So these two things, the earliness of Mark and the fact that Matthew and Luke uses Mark, tells us how important Mark should be. Mark is far from just a summary of these things written later. Mark is early, and Mark is reliably used by, or considered reliable by, Matthew and Luke. In other words, both these two things point to the fact that if we are interested in the earliest account, reliable by the standards of Matthew and Luke, we got to be looking at Mark. All right, so that just made sense to me. And later on, when I started reading scholarly works on the historical Jesus, this is exactly then what I found. They major in Mark because just by scientific scholarly methods, the methods historians use to establish how likely probable things are historically, they'll go to the best source. And most of them always go for Mark. All right, so the last little piece of information, it's the third piece of information that led me to think differently about all the Gospels, really, and especially Mark, is that our Gospels were written anonymously. What do we mean by that? The Gospels don't say who wrote them. The headings, the Gospel of Mark, Gospel of Matthew, Gospel of Luke, or Gospel according to either of those, or John, is a heading that we only found at the end of the 2nd century. We start seeing these headings appear, or people start mentioning this. In other words, what I'm trying to say, and what scholars are saying, 100 years nobody mentioned that if they had Mark, nobody mentions it was written by Mark. It wasn't on. We can't verify that it was on the document. And if it was written by Mark, why doesn't Mark say, "Hello, my name is Mark. We went, me and Jesus walked from here to there," or Peter and Jesus, or sorry for that. Mark is not an eyewitness anyway, because John Mark wasn't there. But someone like Matthew, for instance, who is considered by the church tradition, my tradition, to be an eyewitness. He doesn't write in the first person at all. He doesn't say, "Me and Jesus came to my house, and I was a tax collector, and this is what he said to me," or "we went." It's all in the third person. And another piece of information that's just really interesting, and it kind of just demonstrates this, is that the weird thing is that Matthew uses Mark almost verbatim in many places when he writes about his own conversion. That doesn't make sense. The point is that Matthew uses Mark, who wasn't the first person in the first place, or an eyewitness in the first place, to write his own conversion story. The moral of the story, and I mean, you can go research this as much as you like, but I'm pretty much convinced, because I've looked at both sides of the coin. I know the church's evidence for the writing of the Gospel of Matthew by Matthew, and Luke by Luke, and Mark by Mark, and I find it completely unconvincing. And so do most critical scholars. They do not accept it as a valid way. They cannot verify that these Gospels were written by these first eyewitnesses, number one. Number two, the Gospels themselves don't say that explicitly, and also implicitly. They differ way too much for the Gospel of Matthew and John to be written by two people that sat around the same table at the Last Supper. It doesn't make any logical sense. You have to presuppose it dogmatically and then try and gymnastically get around all the issues. So the point of all of this is to say, if you value the New Testament and you're reading to find Jesus, which I hope most people still do, because I just these days I just see people weaponizing the New Testament to make it fit what they help them hate who they want to hate and love who they want to love. But if you're interested in the New Testament, where it comes from, who wrote it, and how it can lead us to what Jesus was really like, Mark is not the black sheep of this family of Gospels, but Mark, in fact, is the star of the show. Mark is absolutely the star of the show. Now, I didn't intend to talk about John, but maybe I can just say one or two things about John as you might be asking yourself those questions. Now, John is believed to be written at least another 10 to 15 years after Luke or Matthew. Some scholars might believe, or they do believe, that John has literary dependence on either Matthew, Mark, or Luke, but most I've written do not acknowledge that and say that John is completely independent. But most scholars also recognize that John is so different from Mark that it seems to be quite obvious that John is a theological writing and not a historical biography, that it has some timeline of what Jesus would have done, but there's so much different between John and Mark that scholars don't accept John. If you want to know what Jesus actually said, what he actually taught, you're not going to find much of that in John, because John doesn't agree with the other Gospels on those major things. And for many other reasons, which are beyond the scope of today, John is probably the furthest from if we have to rank them, John is probably the furthest from the historical Jesus. That's why John is not considered a synoptic gospel. It's just too different. It's too late. And it's been influenced by the theology of the people who wrote it almost 60 to 70 years after Jesus. That's a long, long time. Point of all this being simply, Mark, 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 Mark. Mark is the star of the historical Jesus show. Now, maybe I can say at this point, I'm busy working on a small series. It's called The Historical Jesus, and it's based on the work of E.P. Sanders, his landmark work on the historical Jesus from 1993. I'm working off the first edition called The Figure of the Historical Christ. And I'm going to put that into like little sessions. I haven't decided yet whether I'm going to do it in a closed Facebook group like I normally do those, or whether I'll run them here in the YouTube channel. Maybe you can just drop me a comment which you would prefer if you're interested. But it's literally changing my life, because I've realized that us Christians, we follow the Jesus of convenience and of our dogma. And when we reconstruct historically that which we can, we actually find some surprising and some fresh and beautiful things about Jesus, which seem to have gone lost by now. Anyway, so the significance of Mark then, based on these findings, we're fully aware, and so are scholars, that earlier texts are not always necessarily more accurate. But considering the idea that Matthew and Luke both used Mark as a credible source, brings validity to its accuracy, at least in the eyes of Matthew and Luke then. Consider the fact that someone like Matthew, I've already used this, so I'll just leave it at that. Granting the authorship of Matthew as Matthew, the disciple of Jesus. Let's say, for instance, that you do believe that Matthew was in fact Matthew, the tax collector, a disciple of Jesus. The fact that he uses Mark verbatim on so many places must tell you how accurate Mark really is. But now the reality is that scholars reject that Matthew was written by the actual Matthew, the tax collector, and that it's also an anonymous gospel written by someone in Greek at a much later stage from oral traditions possibly that they had. All right, this is one of the things we'll tackle in the course. E.P. Sanders as the best explanation I've ever heard for how the Gospels actually came to be written. I was absolutely fascinated by it, and we'll be dealing with some of that in there as well. So scholars generally accept that Matthew and Luke uses Mark, as I've said, and it adapts it in ways that fit with their later individual theological approaches. For instance, what you'll find if you study these Gospels, the scholars have done so well for the last 150 to 200 years. Matthew focuses on the Jewishness of Jesus. He paints Jesus as the new Moses. That's why his birth narrative looks like that. While Luke seems to be writing something much more for the Gentiles, focuses on the temple, and that's why his birth narrative, for instance, looks like that. And also the genealogies, very different because of the emphasis of the writer. Okay, so this might account for the different birth narratives and genealogies, as I've just said. So it's generally accepted in scholarship, but not so much in church, that Matthew and Luke are embellishing Mark. They possibly had another source for the sayings of Jesus, but the events are embellished. They are evolved. They have been changed deliberately by Matthew and Luke to suit their themes. Um, and this is why they changed. They deliberately, not because they're trying to deceive someone or they're trying to preach something that there's no deception in there. They're doing the best at what they can with what they have, and they believe they know a little bit better than Mark, basically, on some of these issues. The point of all of this is simply, if you're looking for Jesus, Mark is more important, much more important than what they ever told me in church. They never told me this. This is you. You're not going to go to a Sunday service, and someone's going to say these things. That's not going to happen, and that's part of the reason why I do this. I want Christians to know what's in the Bible and how it works, and where to find the historical Jesus. It seems that Mark is going to be our best place. Um, the undisputed writings of Paul, of course, is even earlier than Mark. Right? They're about the 50s, so we're looking 20 to 10 years earlier than Mark, which is great. The problem is just Paul never knew Jesus. And if he did, he doesn't write about the life of Jesus. He has maybe 3 sayings about Jesus. One of the most attested historical sayings of Jesus, don't get divorced, is one of the things he mentions. And there's 1 or 2 others, but there's no narrative of the life of Jesus in the life of in the writings of Paul. And so we're back to Mark. That's basically what's going on. Mark was first. To make it clear, we don't have any reason to believe that Mark was writing, and this I often find people saying this to me when I mention this to them. Yeah, but Mark, he leaves out things that Matthew and Luke and John would later write. There's absolutely no reason to believe that Mark was writing, knowing or considering or expecting that Matthew, Luke, and John would write down what he leaves out. We have to, for all logical reasons, accept that Mark was writing his best account of the life of Jesus. If Mark doesn't include a virgin birth, which is rather huge, it means that Mark didn't know of a virgin birth. If Mark's not including resurrection stories, it probably means that Mark had no knowledge of the exact resurrection stories. Mark writes down what he has. He writes down well, and there is a theme of secrecy and so on when it comes to the teaching and life of Jesus. But we can't let the literary theme overrule everything else. This is someone writing so that people will know who Jesus is. The first line of this gospel is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Some versions say the Son of God. That's the point of this writing. If Mark knew that Jesus was born like a virgin, this would be the most important thing to say in his gospel. If Mark knew that Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, the life, I'm the bread of life, I'm the vine, and all the I am sayings, before Abraham was, I am, me and the Father are one. If Mark knew these sayings, he would have built them into his gospel because they would have shown us exactly what he was trying to do. The most simplest understanding is Mark didn't have this information, right? Okay. Mark wasn't anticipating a later complementary work. But the other way is true. Matthew, Luke, they had Mark and they added material. So that's the best way to understand this from the data, right? Not from your church dogma, but from the data. Um, but when we read Mark, we shouldn't have Matthew, Luke, and John in view, therefore. So what's the point of this? When you're reading Mark, you can't say while you're reading, oh, Mark didn't include this story, but we have it here, here, and here. Mark didn't know about this story. And unfortunately, it is true that some of the stories in the New Testament were added later. Some of these stories come to 300 years after the Gospels were written. My most favorite story, the adulterous woman caught in the act, brought before Jesus. Jesus writes in the sand, he who throws the first stone, um, he who's never sinned or was without sin, throw the first stone, was added centuries after to the Gospel of John. The point of all of this is we will never really know what was added and what wasn't, but we can at least get to something similar, something close in approximation by applying good historical methods. And what I'm trying to say here today is the closest you're going to get is Mark. Mark is the closest. All right. So what I'm saying is, but when we read Mark, we shouldn't have Matthew, Luke, or John in view as a complement because it did not exist at the time that Mark was written. Neither did Mark have this in view, of course. Mark gives us Jesus as he understood him at his time of writing. Okay, my final thoughts for today. Right. These facts brought me to a fresh understanding of the sense of the uniqueness and the priority of Mark in the New Testament and specifically in the Gospels. I went back and I had to re-study Mark because I hardly knew it because I never spent any time in there. And I then had to go look at why does Matthew change certain sentences in Mark? Why does he use everything the same and then here he'll leave something out or add something? Now, you might be surprised, maybe not. Scholars have been doing this for decades. For the last 150, 200 years, I've been doing this. There's a lot of work on this. People have spent their lives dissecting this. And from this, some brave souls have ventured to write works on the historical Jesus because they feel like, to some degree, they can verify what Jesus might have taught, how he might have taught it, what he might have been like, what he might have believed, etc., etc. But there are things in our Gospels which are embellished, which most probably do not go back to a historical Jesus. And this is something we need to face, something we need to work through. It upsets the apple cart. And if you're a dedicated Christian, as I am, it upsets your own identity as well. And you need to go look again. It's not a nice place to be, but it's better to face the truth than to put your head in the sand. So I had to go back. I studied it anew, trying to uproot my traditional views of Mark as just a little bonus summary at the end. I try to strip my thoughts from the influence of the other Gospels and try to isolate, like do exercises of isolating Mark when I'm reading, seeing if the Mark of Jesus and the Jesus of Mark and the Jesus of John, are they really that different? And to my absolute shock, I realized through the work of scholars, reading carefully, someone showing me a different perspective, I realized these are two very, very different people that they are describing. The ministry styles are different. The teaching methods are different. The narratives are different. The type of miracles are different. The discourses are different. The content of the discourses are different. The list goes on and on and on. So the point I'm trying to make is it's not nice to hear that Mark and Luke are so different. But the good news is we know which one should take priority. That's the good news in trying to reconstruct a type of a historical Jesus. Right. So, so for the first time, I started reading this most important gospel of the New Testament with brand new eyes, reading it as if it's the most important, giving it the highest priority. And I would like to share some of these thoughts and some of the conclusions in some of these sessions that will follow. Next week, what I would like to do is just go and have a look at Mark now. Knowing this about Mark, we need to know, what do we actually know about the Gospel of Mark? What manuscripts do we have? How far are they removed from the time that we believe Mark was actually written? How much of these manuscripts tell us what is actually in Mark? How did Mark get its name? Why do we believe it was written? Why do people believe? The tradition believes it was written by John Mark. I don't believe that. It was written anonymously. So I want to have a look at Mark in detail, but from a more data perspective. I don't want to come at Mark to tell you what to believe. I want to come at Mark to show what we know about Mark. Unfortunately, a lot of these things are just not as certain as we would like them to be. So, Mark, in a sense, is that the swan that's born in the duckyard, different from the beginning, different size egg, different color scheme, different speckles on it, and everybody's looking at it and saying, "Oh, we don't know what's going to come out of this." And eventually, this ugly duckling becomes the swan of the Gospels, and any serious scholar knows that Mark is the swan, and this is how they construct their historical research. Um, so I'll leave you with that today. I want to just quickly mention again, I'm going to be doing a series on the historical Jesus. So watch out for that. It is interesting. It is shocking in some places. It is counterintuitive. I had to repent for a lot of nonsense I've been teaching all my life and realizing that I was wrong. I was following the Jesus that was taught to me by my culture. And the actual Jesus, there is a probability that a lot about him was very different. And it's difficult because you want to follow Jesus, not Christianity and not dogma. So I'll leave you with that. Have a wonderful Sunday. See you next time. Cheers.